Vanessa tossed the past-due tuition invoice for my autistic nephew's school onto the marble counter. "You'll move into his suite and act as his private nurse," she said coldly, barely looking up from her phone. "If you refuse, Leo's funding stops today. He'll be out of that special program by Monday." My soon-to-be brother-in-law, Julian, was lying in a VIP room upstairs, a paralyzed billionaire she was eager to discard. I looked at the invoice, then at the medical scrubs she had already laid out. A calculated trade for an 8-year-old's future. I picked them up. I did not cry as I walked down the pristine, soundproofed corridors of the private recovery facility. Tears were a luxury that did not pay for specialised behavioural therapy. And they certainly would not move Vanessa. I pushed open the heavy oak door to the VIP suite. The room was massive, sterile, and painfully quiet. It smelled of industrial bleach and expensive, artificial floral spray. In the centre of the room lay Julian Sterling, the heir to a $450 million technology and real estate empire, was currently reduced to a motionless figure surrounded by a complex web of medical machinery. The rhythmic hissing of the ventilator was the only indication that life still existed within these four walls. I stood at the foot of his bed and simply observed. I was a sensory therapist by trade, trained to understand how environments shape the human nervous system. This room was a sensory deprivation chamber. The harsh, fluorescent lights overhead cast sharp, unforgiving shadows across his pale face. The ambient temperature was kept uncomfortably low. It was an environment designed for the convenience of the medical staff, not for the healing of a human being. I set my bag down and began to work. I did not ask for permission. I walked over to the electronic control panel and dimmed the overhead lights, allowing the natural muted sunlight from the Pacific coast to fill the space. I adjusted the thermostat, raising the temperature to a subtle, comforting warmth. I moved the heavily scented floral arrangements out into the hallway. A healing mind requires a calm environment, not a chemical assault. I approached the bed. Julian looked entirely absent. His features were sharp, aristocratic, and completely still. I pulled a chair close and sat down. I introduced myself in a low, even tone. I told him my name. I told him I would be taking care of his physical needs and that I would treat him with the dignity he deserved. Regardless of whether he could hear me or not, I poured warm water into a basin, dipped a soft microfiber cloth into it, and wrung it out. I began to carefully clean his face, wiping away the clinical residue left by the morning shift. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I traced the cloth over his forehead and down his cheekbones. As I gently wiped the area near his right temple, my hand froze. It was a microscopic detail, something anyone else would have missed. Beneath the thin skin of his closed eyelid, the pupil darted. It was not a random, involuntary muscle spasm. It was a sharp, horizontal track, a deliberate movement. People often wonder why someone stays in a toxic dynamic. They ask why you do not simply walk out the door and never look back. What they fail to understand is the invisible chain of survival. I did not stay in Vanessa's orbit because I was weak. I stayed because I had an 8-year-old autistic nephew named Leo, who relied entirely on the Advanced Sensory Centre in the city. The centre cost $24,000 a semester. Vanessa held the purse strings, an arrangement established long ago when I was brought into the family as nothing more than a convenient accessory to make them look charitable. I was conditioned from childhood to accept the scraps. Vanessa was the golden child, trained to hunt for status and prestige, eventually securing an engagement to Julian Sterling. I was the shadow, expected to be grateful for the roof over my head. But submission is a fascinating concept. Over the years, my outward compliance became a shield. It was a strategic retreat. I let Vanessa believe she had absolute power because a comfortable tyrant is a careless tyrant. I endured the daily humiliations, the condescending remarks, and the threats regarding Leo's education. I absorbed it all, storing it away in a quiet, locked vault in my mind. I sat beside Julian's bed, writing in my leather-bound notebook. I recorded the exact time I adjusted the room temperature. I noted the specific type of unmedicated lotion I used on his hands to prevent his skin from cracking. I treated his body like a delicate ecosystem that required perfect balance. The steady hum of the machines provided a white noise background to my thoughts. I watched the cardiac monitor, tracing the green peaks and valleys. I looked from the screen to his chest. The ventilator hissed, pushing air into his lungs. His chest rose. The machine clicked, and his chest fell. I stared closer, my pen pausing on the lined paper. Something was wrong. The mechanical rhythm of the machine was perfect, but the subtle muscle tension in his neck and shoulders was resisting it. It was an incredibly faint discrepancy. The machine was forcing a breath, but his body was trying to initiate one a fraction of a second earlier. It was a silent, desperate battle between biology and artificial support. He was fighting the machine. I set my notebook aside. The discrepancy in the breathing rhythm was a massive anomaly. Medical reports stated Julian was in a deep vegetative state, entirely devoid of higher cognitive function. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small vial of organic cedarwood essential oil. Sen is the most primitive and direct pathway to the brain. I placed a single drop on a cotton swab and held it near his face, allowing the subtle, grounding aroma to waft over him. Next, I picked up my tablet. Julian was the chief executive of a massive technology conglomerate. His brain was wired for data, strategy, and market shifts. I opened a financial news application and began to read aloud. I did not use a soothing, patronizing voice. I spoke exactly as I would in a boardroom. I read the opening market figures. I detailed the recent merger of a rival semiconductor firm. I analysed the projected quarterly losses of his subsidiary branches. I kept my eyes locked on the cardiac monitor. For the first 3 minutes, the green line remained utterly stable. But as I read a specific paragraph detailing a hostile takeover attempt against one of his key tech patents, the line spiked. His heart rate jumped from 62 to 85 beats per minute in a matter of seconds. I stopped reading. The line gradually settled. I read the sentence again. The spike returned immediately. I placed the tablet on the bedside table. My pulse drummed in my ears, but my hands remained perfectly steady. I leaned in close to his face, my voice barely above a whisper. I told him that I saw the monitor. I told him that I knew he was listening to the financial report. I explained my background in sensory analysis. I gave him a clear, simple instruction. I told him that if he could hear my voice, if he was conscious inside that silent shell, he needed to look up. I waited. The room was suffocatingly quiet. 10 seconds passed. Then, slowly, deliberately, his eyelids fluttered open. His dark eyes were stark, clear, and fiercely intelligent. They moved straight up toward the ceiling, held the position for 3 seconds, and then lowered to meet my gaze. It was locked-in syndrome, complete physical paralysis with absolute cognitive awareness. He was buried alive inside his own bones. We stared at each other, sharing the crushing weight of the truth. He was still in there. The sound of designer heels clicking against the linoleum hallway signalled Vanessa's arrival. It was a harsh, intrusive noise that immediately shattered the fragile peace I had built inside the room. She pushed the door open without knocking, bringing a cloud of heavy, overwhelming designer perfume with her. I quietly stepped back into the shadows near the medical supply cart. exactly where she preferred me to be. Invisible. Vanessa walked over to the bed, holding a customized iced coffee. She did not touch Julian. She did not speak to him. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began scrolling, sighing loudly. She complained to the empty room about the inconvenience of the situation. She talked about the massive non-refundable deposits she might lose for the wedding venue in Italy. She grumbled about how embarrassing it was to explain his condition to her social circle. She spoke about him as if he were a broken appliance that was disrupting her carefully curated aesthetic timeline. I watched Julian's face. To Vanessa, he looked exactly the same, but I saw the microscopic tightening of his jaw. I looked up at the monitors. The green line of his heart rate was climbing rapidly. 90. 100. 110. The alarms on the machines were set to trigger at 120. If the alarms went off, nurses would flood the room, and Vanessa would use the opportunity to play the distressed, grieving fiancé for the medical staff. I had to intervene before the machine betrayed his consciousness. I stepped forward swiftly, positioning myself between Vanessa and the monitors. I reached out and adjusted a random sensor on his chest, using my body to block her line of sight to the screen. With my other hand, I slipped my fingers under the blanket and firmly grasped his cold, motionless hand. I squeezed his palm twice, a silent command to steady himself. Do not let her see you. Do not give her the satisfaction. Slowly, agonizingly. The numbers on the screen began to drop. The spike leveled out just beneath the alarm threshold. Vanessa finally looked up from her phone, glaring at me. She asked what I was doing, her tone dripping with disdain. I looked her directly in the eyes. I told her I was simply adjusting a loose wire. My voice was completely flat, betraying absolutely nothing. She rolled her eyes, turned on her heel, and walked out. The door clicked shut. The days that followed fell into a rigorous, silent rhythm. I established a protocol, drawing heavily on my background in sensory therapy to keep Julian's mind anchored to the physical world. Locked-in syndrome is a terrifying diagnosis. The human brain, deprived of physical output, can easily slip into severe depression or delirium. I was determined not to let that happen. We started with the absolute basics of communication. I stood beside his bed, holding a small, laminated chart I had created. I spoke in a clear, measured tone, instructing him to blink once for yes and twice for no. It took him several agonizing minutes to coordinate the complex neurological pathways required to execute the simple command. But he managed it. One slow, deliberate blink. We had a foundation. From there, we built a lifeline. I went through the alphabet, dividing it into blocks. I would point to a section, wait for a blink, and then narrow down the letters. It was an incredibly tedious process, exhausting for both of us. Sweat would bead on his forehead from the sheer mental exertion of trying to force his paralyzed eyelids to obey his command. I would wipe his brow with a cool cloth, wait for his heart rate to settle, and begin again. We practiced for hours while the facility was quiet. I learned his preferences quickly. He disliked the classical music playlist the morning nurses left on a loop. He preferred the ambient sound of rainfall. He wanted the window blinds left open exactly 2 inches so he could track the passage of the sun across the ceiling. Then, something unusual began to happen. Once the basic communication was established, Julian began initiating a sequence on his own. It always happened right after Vanessa left the room. The lingering scent of her heavy perfume would still hang in the air, and his eyes would begin to move. 4 rapid blinks, a pause. 7 rapid blinks, a pause. 1 blink, a pause. 9 rapid blinks, 4, 7, 1, 9. He repeated it with an urgency that spiked his heart monitor. I wrote the numbers down in my leather notebook, underlining them heavily. I held the page up so he could see it. I asked him if this was a phone number. 2 blinks. No. I asked if it was a date. 2 blinks. No. The frustration in his eyes was palpable. He was a man accustomed to issuing commands and watching entire corporate divisions execute them instantly. Now, he was reduced to tapping out numerical codes with his eyelashes to a sensory therapist he barely knew. I told him to rest. I promised him I would figure it out. I folded the piece of paper and slipped it into the pocket of my medical scrubs. The numbers etched themselves into my memory. 4, 7, 1, 9. It was a lock waiting for a key. I kept the secret safe. The coastal fog rolled in heavily over Monterey Bay that evening, bringing a steady, drumming rain against the reinforced glass of the VIP suite. The ward was operating on skeleton staff, leaving the corridors hollow and echoing. I turned off the harsh overhead fluorescents and switched on a small, warm reading lamp near the corner of the room. The darkness outside made the room feel like a capsule suspended in space. I pulled my chair closer to Julian's bed. His eyes were open, tracking my movements. The machines hummed their constant, mechanical lullaby. I decided to speak to him not as a patient, but as a person. I told him about Leo. I described my 8-year-old nephew's fascination with spinning objects, how a simple ceiling fan could captivate him for hours. I talked about the sensory centre, the specialised educators, and the astronomical tuition fees that kept Leo safe from a world completely unequipped to handle his mind. I did not raise my voice or seek pity. I laid out the facts like a balance sheet. I explained that Vanessa held the funding for that school. I told him that my presence in this room, wiping his face and reading him financial reports, was the price I paid to ensure Leo did not lose his sanctuary. I looked into Julian's eyes. I saw the sharp, unyielding intelligence trapped behind them. I told him that I understood what it meant to be caged. His cage was biological, a cruel neurological short circuit that locked him inside his own bones. My cage was financial and familial, built by years of subtle manipulation and leveraged dependency. But the fundamental architecture of the prison was exactly the same. We were both screaming in soundproof rooms, waiting for someone to notice. The silence that followed was heavy, but completely devoid of tension. It was the specific kind of quiet that occurs when two isolated people finally recognize each other. Julian stared at me for a long time. The ambient light caught the slight moisture in his eyes. He did not blink twice for no. He did not blink once for yes. He simply closed his eyes incredibly slowly, holding them shut for a full 5 seconds before opening them again. It was not a code. It was an acknowledgement. It was a silent vow exchanged in the sterile glow of medical equipment. We were bound by the shared understanding of what it meant to survive under the absolute control of someone else. I reached out and rested my hand lightly over his. His skin was cool, but the pulse beneath my fingertips was steady and strong. We were not entirely alone anymore. The rain continued to fall. I sat there listening to the rhythm of the storm, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. For years, I had believed that endurance was my only weapon. I thought that if I just kept my head down, did the work, and protected Leo, the universe would eventually balance the scales. But looking at Julian, I realised that passive survival was not enough. Vanessa would never willingly relinquish her leverage. She would extract every ounce of utility from both of us until there was nothing left to consume. The realization was cold, sharp, and deeply liberating. Julian needed an advocate, and I needed an exit strategy. The rain drummed against the thick window panes. The heavy oak door swung open the next afternoon, ushering in a wave of manicured chaos. Mrs. Sterling had arrived. Julian's mother was a formidable woman, the chief architect of the Sterling family's real estate expansion, known for her ruthless efficiency and impeccable poise. Today, however, the sharp lines of her face were softened by genuine exhaustion. Before she could even approach the bed, Vanessa was there. My stepsister rushed forward, perfectly styled in muted, tasteful designer clothing that suggested mourning without sacrificing elegance. She intercepted Mrs. Sterling with a practiced, tragic expression. I retreated to my usual corner near the medical supply cart, folding my hands in front of me. I became part of the furniture. Vanessa immediately launched into her performance. She grasped Mrs. Sterling's hands, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. She spoke of the sleepless nights she had endured, sitting right where I had been sitting, holding Julian's hand and praying for a miracle. She described how agonizing it was to watch the man she loved fade away. It was a masterful display of manipulation, designed entirely to secure her position within the Sterling empire. I watched Mrs. Sterling. The older woman looked at Vanessa with a mixture of sympathy and subtle weariness. Then, Mrs. Sterling moved past her to stand over her son. Julian's eyes were tightly shut. He had heard Vanessa enter. He had heard her voice, and he had made a conscious, deliberate choice to close the curtains. He was refusing to participate in her theatrical production. Mrs. Sterling reached out and gently touched his cheek. She called his name softly. She asked him to open his eyes. Just for a moment, just for his mother. I held my breath. I knew Julian could hear her. I knew the monumental effort it took for him to keep his eyelids clamped shut when his mother was pleading with him. But opening his eyes meant validating Vanessa's presence. It meant rewarding her lies with an audience. The monitors above his bed remained perfectly steady. His heart rate did not spike. He controlled his physiological responses with the iron discipline of a seasoned executive. Mrs. Sterling sighed, her shoulders slumping. She turned back to Vanessa, looking defeated. Vanessa offered a perfectly timed, comforting smile, assuring her that she would never leave his side. I watched the entire exchange with cold detachment. The room felt entirely hollow. Mrs. Sterling stayed for another 20 minutes, mostly sitting in silence while Vanessa maintained a steady stream of whispered, sorrowful commentary. Vanessa spoke about the wedding plans that were now on hold, subtly reminding the matriarch of her impending legal status within the family. It was a calculated reminder of her claim to the Sterling name. Mrs. Sterling finally stood up, smoothing the front of her immaculate blazer. She thanked Vanessa for her unwavering dedication, her voice devoid of its usual commanding edge. As Mrs. Sterling walked out, Vanessa escorted her to the door, playing the role of the devoted guardian right up to the final second. The heavy door clicked shut behind them. I remained in the corner, watching the space where the matriarch had just stood. Julian's eyes remained closed. The performance was over. The instant the latch engaged, the atmosphere in the room violently shifted. Vanessa dropped the sorrowful mask so quickly it was almost jarring. The manufactured tears vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hardness. She walked back to the centre of the room, her heels striking the floor with sharp, aggressive intent. She did not look at me. She walked directly to the side of Julian's bed and looked down at his motionless face. The devotion she had just paraded for Mrs. Sterling evaporated into thin air. Vanessa leaned over, resting her hands on the metal bed rails. She began to speak to him, her voice low, conversational, and utterly terrifying. She told him that she was incredibly bored. She complained that this facility was depressing and that she was missing the social season in Los Angeles. She looked at his closed eyes and laughed softly, a dry, humorless sound. She told him that the doctors had practically given up hope. She said it was only a matter of time before they officially declared his condition permanent. Then, she revealed the core of her strategy. She whispered that once the final neurological assessment confirmed zero higher brain function, her medical power of attorney would become fully executable. She would have the absolute legal authority to make the compassionate decision to discontinue his life support. She would inherit the pre-nuptial trust assets, maintain the sterling connection, and finally be free of this sterile, depressing room. She spoke about his death as if it were a minor administrative hurdle on her path to financial independence. I stood frozen in the corner. I looked up at the monitors. Julian's eyes were still closed, but the machinery was screaming the truth. His heart rate was rocketing upward. 80, 95, 115. The alarm was seconds away from triggering. His blood pressure spiked dangerously high. He was hearing every single word of his own execution plan. He was locked inside a paralyzed body, listening to the woman he was supposed to marry casually map out his murder. I moved, I did not run, and I did not panic. I walked swiftly to the control panel, deliberately knocking a stainless steel medical tray to the floor with a loud, clattering crash. Vanessa jumped, spinning around to glare at me. I offered a flat, unapologetic look, bending down to pick up the scattered instruments. The sudden noise and the distraction broke her focus. She cursed under her breath, grabbed her designer handbag, and marched toward the exit. She told me to clean up the mess and properly earn my keep. The heavy door closed. I waited until I heard the sound of her heels fade completely down the corridor. Only then did I turn back to the bed. Julian's eyes were wide open now, staring blindly at the ceiling. The terror and absolute fury radiating from him were palpable, charging the air in the room with a heavy, electric tension. I walked over and placed both of my hands firmly on his shoulders, grounding him. I spoke to him in the sharpest, clearest voice I could manage. I told him to breathe. I told him that I heard everything. I promised him, with absolute certainty, that she was not going to win. The green line on the monitor slowly began to fall. The following morning, I waited for the shift change. I needed someone with actual medical authority, someone whose professional integrity had not yet been purchased by Vanessa's aggressive charm. I sought out Dr. Aris. He was an older physician, the former head of neurology who had been subtly marginalised when the Sterling family's private medical team arrived. I found him in the cramped, dimly lit charting room at the end of the hall. The room smelled of stale black coffee and old paper records. He looked up from his tablet, his expression guarded. I did not offer a dramatic plea. I walked in, closed the door behind me, and placed my leather notebook on his desk. I opened it to the pages containing weeks of meticulously recorded data. I showed him the precise timestamps of Julian's heart rate spikes correlating exactly with specific environmental stimuli. I showed him the blink response logs. I pointed to the sections where I had asked complex, multi-layered questions and documented the corresponding single or double blinks. I presented it not as a desperate theory, but as an undeniable, empirical data set. Doctor, Aris put on his reading glasses. He reviewed the charts in silence. I watched his eyes track across the columns of numbers and observations. For 5 minutes, the only sound in the room was the hum of the server rack. Finally. He took his glasses off and looked at me. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a profound, heavy realization. He recognized the pattern. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He confirmed it in a whisper. Locked-in syndrome. The patient was entirely conscious. I felt a brief surge of victory, but Dr. Aris immediately extinguished it. He closed the notebook and handed it back to me. His voice was grim. He explained the harsh reality of our situation. Vanessa held the medical power of attorney. She controlled access, treatment protocols, And the narrative? If I went to the administration now with handwritten notes, Vanessa's high-priced lawyers would instantly discredit me as an unstable, manipulative caregiver trying to extort the family. They would ban me from the facility within an hour, and Julian would be completely isolated. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. He told me that medical truth meant absolutely nothing without legal leverage. To stop Vanessa from executing her plan, I did not just need a medical diagnosis, I needed a weapon made of paper and ink. I needed documentation that superseded her authority. I walked out of the charting room with the notebook pressed against my chest. The warning echoed in my mind. Legal leverage. I thought about the strange sequence Julian had tapped out with his eyes. 4, 7, 1, 9. It was not just a code, it was a map. I returned to Julian's room and locked the door from the inside. I stood at the foot of his bed, meeting his intense, unblinking gaze. I told him about the conversation with Dr. Aris. I laid out the brutal truth his diagnosis was not enough to save him from Vanessa's legal authority. I pulled the notebook from my pocket and held up the page with the numbers. I asked him directly if this code led to something that could strip Vanessa of her power. One slow, deliberate blink. Yes. The game had fundamentally changed. We were no longer just fighting for his medical recovery. We were preparing for a legal war. I spent the next 3 days interrogating the silence. The numbers 4, 7, 1, and 9 ran through my mind on a continuous loop. I used the quiet hours of the early morning, before the administrative staff arrived, to initiate our grueling game of 20 questions. I stood at the side of Julian's bed, my voice a low, steady murmur. I asked if the numbers represented a bank account PIN. 2 blinks. No. I asked if they belonged to a security system at his corporate headquarters. 2 blinks. No. The process was exhausting for him. Coordinating the ocular muscles required intense neurological focus, but his determination never wavered. I had to narrow the scope. I asked if the item we were looking for was located inside the Monterey facility. 1 slow, definitive blink. Yes. That revelation shifted everything. When a patient is admitted to a high-security private recovery ward, all personal belongings not immediately required for care are catalogued and locked in the basement archive. I asked him if the code was for his personal effects locker. 1 blink. Yes. I asked if there was a specific document inside. 2 blinks. No. I asked if it was a digital storage device. 1 blink. Yes. The strategy was finally taking shape. I did not need to break into a corporate office or bypass a heavily guarded bank vault. The answers were sitting directly beneath our feet, stored in a plastic bin labelled with his patient identification number. I pulled out my notebook and carefully documented the findings, disguising the notes as routine sensory therapy logs. I wrote about establishing baseline visual tracking. I wrote about cognitive engagement. Anyone reading the chart would see a dedicated therapist making slow, incremental progress. Julian watched me write, his breathing steady and synchronized with the machine. I explained the logistical hurdle. The basement archive was monitored by the facility's security team. Access was strictly regulated, usually requiring authorization from the primary medical proxy. Vanessa held that power. I could not simply walk down there and demand his belongings without raising immediate suspicion. I told Julian I needed a plausible medical excuse to access his box. I needed a reason that sounded so mundane and therapeutic that no one would second-guess it. I spent the remainder of the shift formulating a flawless administrative request. The path was clear. I needed a specialised item, something highly specific to my field of practice that could conceivably be buried in his luggage. I decided on a customised weighted therapeutic blanket. I documented a fabricated observation in his medical chart, noting severe involuntary muscle spasms during the night shift. I wrote that a weighted blanket, specifically the one he supposedly packed for his pre-wedding trip, would provide necessary deep pressure stimulation to regulate his nervous system. I submitted the formal request to the nursing station. I did not ask Vanessa. I relied entirely on the bureaucratic machinery of the hospital. The basement archive of the Monterey facility was a clinical mausoleum. The air smelled of sterile plastic and processed dust. I stood before the security desk, holding my staff identification badge and the approved requisition form. The guard on duty barely glanced at the paperwork. He typed a few keystrokes, handed me an electronic key card, and pointed down the long row of steel cages. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. I found the locker marked with Julian's patient identification number. The locker secured a large, heavy-duty plastic container. It was sealed with a digital padlock. I took a slow, steady breath, centering myself. I reached out and pressed the keypad. 4, 7, 1, 9. The lock flashed a small green light and clicked open with a satisfying metallic snap. I lifted the lid. The box contained the remnants of the life he was living before the crash. There were expensive silk ties, a platinum watch, and a leather toiletry bag. I carefully pushed these items aside, searching for the digital device he had confirmed. At the very bottom, tucked inside the inner zippered pocket of a bespoke suit jacket, my fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. I pulled it out. It was a sleek, encrypted flash drive, heavy and cold in my palm. Beneath the drive, resting in the same pocket, was a heavy cardstock business card. The card bore the embossed crest of a premier corporate law firm based in Los Angeles. The name on the card was Eleanor Vance, Senior Managing Partner. I did not celebrate. I did not smile. I simply slipped the flash drive and the business card into the deep pocket of my medical scrubs. I carefully rearranged the ties and the watch to look exactly as they had before. I closed the lid, engaged the digital lock, and scrambled the numbers. I grabbed a generic grey blanket from a nearby surplus shelf to serve as my alibi. I walked back to the security desk, returned the keycard, and signed the exit ledger. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I walked back toward the elevator, feeling the solid weight of the flash drive against my leg. The weapon was loaded. The elevator ride back to the VIP ward felt infinite. I stared at the brushed steel doors, calculating my next precise move. I knew better than to plug an encrypted drive into a hospital computer. The facility's network was undoubtedly monitored, and I could not risk leaving a digital footprint. I had to wait until my shift ended, until I was safely inside the four walls of my own apartment. I stepped off the elevator and walked back into Julian's room. Vanessa was not there. The room was perfectly quiet. I walked over to the bed and draped the grey blanket over the chair. I looked down at Julian. He tracked my movement, his eyes sharp and questioning. I gave him a single, subtle nod. He closed his eyes slowly, a silent exhalation of relief. The physical breakthrough happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The coastal sunlight was filtering through the partially open blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Vanessa was sitting in the corner armchair, scrolling through her phone and complaining loudly to a friend about the exorbitant cost of maintaining her lifestyle while trapped in Monterey. I was standing at the side of the bed, performing routine range-of-motion exercises on Julian's right arm to prevent muscle atrophy. I supported his elbow and gently rotated his wrist. I was not looking at his face. My focus was entirely on the tension in his joints. As I stretched his fingers outward, the unexpected happened. His index finger, previously a lifeless appendage, violently contracted. It was a sharp, undeniable muscle spasm that pulled his finger inward, gripping the fabric of my scrub top. I froze. I looked up at his face. His eyes were wide with the exertion of the effort. He had intentionally bypassed the neurological blockade. It was a monumental victory of human willpower. I did not have time to process the triumph. Vanessa had seen it. She dropped her phone into her lap, the screen shattering against the metal armrest. The colour drained entirely from her perfectly made-up face. She stood up, her mouth open, staring at his hand. She did not rush forward to comfort him. She did not press the nurse call button to announce the miraculous sign of recovery. She backed away from the bed as if she had just seen a ghost. I watched the horror dawn in her eyes. I knew exactly what she was processing. She was not looking at her recovering fiancé. She was looking at the sudden, terrifying resurrection of her own accountability. If Julian woke up, her narrative of the grieving, devoted partner would crumble. Her absolute control over his medical care would evaporate. Most importantly, her access to the $450 million empire would be permanently severed. She gripped the strap of her designer bag, her knuckles turning white. She looked at me, panic flaring in her eyes, and ordered me to leave the room immediately. I stepped back, my expression completely neutral, and walked out. I stood in the hallway, listening through the heavy oak door. I did not hear her speaking to him. I did not hear her calling for a doctor. I only heard the frantic, rapid tapping of her phone screen. She was texting. She was strategizing. The miraculous recovery of her supposed true love was nothing more than a catastrophic business crisis she needed to manage. When she finally emerged from the room 20 minutes later, the panic was gone, replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. She did not look at me. She marched straight toward the administration wing. The endgame had officially begun. Fear replaced her greed. Vanessa did not waste time. 48 hours after the finger twitch, she returned to the VIP suite carrying a sleek leather portfolio. I was adjusting Julian's pillows when she walked in. She did not offer a greeting. She walked directly to the foot of the bed and slammed the portfolio down on the mattress. She pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the letterhead of a notorious law firm known for aggressive estate management. She looked at me, her eyes hard and unyielding. She announced her decision with the clinical detachment of an executioner. She stated that Julian's sudden muscle spasms were causing him unnecessary distress. She claimed her private medical consultants had evaluated his case and concluded that the current facility was overstimulating his fragile nervous system. Therefore, acting entirely within her rights as his primary medical proxy. She was transferring him to an exclusive palliative care retreat located in a remote part of the state. Palliative care? It was a sanitized, socially acceptable term for a facility designed solely to manage the dying process. I looked at the documents, then at Julian. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling, the monitors jumping wildly as his heart rate spiked. She was essentially signing his death warrant to protect her financial interests. Vanessa turned her attention fully on me. She delivered the final blow. She informed me that my services were no longer required. She stated that my approach was too aggressive and that I was terminated effective immediately. To ensure my complete compliance, she casually mentioned that she had already contacted Leo's specialized school. She smiled, a thin, predatory stretching of her lips. She told me the tuition check had been permanently cancelled. She expected me to crumble. She expected me to drop to my knees, beg for my job, and plead for the sake of an 8-year-old autistic boy. She was utilising the exact same playbook she had used my entire life, leveraging my deep love for a vulnerable child to force my absolute submission. I looked at the legal papers. I looked at the triumphant sneer on her face. She made her choice. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating. I processed her threats with the cold efficiency of a machine. She had escalated the conflict from manipulation to outright warfare. She thought the threat against Leo was my breaking point. She did not realize that threatening Leo was the one action that completely eradicated any remaining shred of restraint I possessed. I did not react. I did not display a single ounce of the terror she was so desperate to see. I simply nodded once, acknowledging her statement without accepting her reality. I looked down at Julian. His eyes were wide, tracking my every movement. I gave him the slightest, almost imperceptible shake of my head, a silent promise that this was not the end. I turned my back on Vanessa's triumphant smirk. She made her choice. She wanted me to break. She stood there, waiting for the tears, waiting for the desperate bargaining she thrived on. I gave her absolutely nothing. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression, my posture straight and composed. I walked over to the small desk in the corner and began to gather my clinical notes. I placed my pens into my bag. I folded my white laboratory coat. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision. Her smile began to falter, replaced by a subtle flicker of confusion. This was not the script she had written. I picked up my bag and walked toward the door. I paused just before exiting and looked back at her. I told her that I would ensure my final nursing notes were uploaded to the central server by 5 o'clock. I did not mention Leo. I did not mention the palliative care facility. I spoke exclusively about administrative protocol. I walked out into the hallway and let the heavy door click shut. As soon as I was out of sight, I pulled out my phone and dialed the director of Leo's school. I spoke calmly, explaining that there was a temporary administrative error regarding the tuition payment from the family trust. I instructed them to place the account on a temporary hold and assured them that an alternate certified payment structure would be established within 72 hours. I projected absolute authority, and the director agreed without question. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who do not have a plan. I walked out of the Monterey facility and drove back to my small, quiet apartment. If you've ever had to stay calm while someone tried to destroy your life, drop A in the comments and tell me how you survived it. The apartment was dark when I arrived. I locked the deadbolt, set my bag on the kitchen counter, and retrieved the sleek metal flash drive from the pocket of my scrubs. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The silence in the room was absolute. I held the drive in my hand, feeling the cold metal against my skin. This small piece of hardware was the culmination of weeks of silent communication. I took a slow breath, inserted the drive into the port, and waited. A password prompt immediately appeared on the screen. The security protocols were exactly what I expected from a man who ran a technology empire. I did not hesitate. I typed the sequence that had been burned into my memory. 4, 7, 1, 9. I pressed the enter key. The progress bar spun for 3 seconds before the encryption dissolved. A single folder appeared on the desktop, labelled simply with the current year. I clicked it open. The files inside were meticulously organised, numbered sequentially, and stamped with digital verification seals. I began to read. The screen glowed bright. The primary document on the encrypted flash drive was a 70-page legal contract. I scrolled through the dense, meticulously drafted text, my eyes scanning the intricate financial terminology. I am not a lawyer, but you do not need a law degree to recognise a brilliantly constructed trap. Julian had not simply secured his assets. He had completely isolated them. The document was a meticulously structured, irrevocable trust, established a mere 3 weeks before his catastrophic accident. The timing alone was a profound statement of his distrust toward the woman he was supposed to marry. A standard power of attorney is a remarkably fragile instrument. It grants an agent the authority to act on your behalf, but it relies entirely on the assumption that the agent is acting in your best interest. It is a flexible document, easily manipulated by someone with the right level of greed and the wrong kind of morals. Vanessa had banked her entire strategy on the broad, sweeping powers granted by a standard medical and financial proxy. She assumed that controlling his physical body equated to controlling his empire. She was fundamentally wrong. An irrevocable trust operates on an entirely different plane of reality. Once signed and funded, the assets no longer belong to the individual who created it. They belong to the trust itself, managed by an independent trustee. Julian had transferred the entirety of his $450 million portfolio, his intellectual property rights, and his controlling voting shares into this legal fortress. Vanessa's power of attorney meant absolutely nothing against it. She could not sell a single share. She could not authorize the liquidation of a single corporate asset. The brilliance of the document lay in its specific medical stipulations. Julian had included a highly specialized clause regarding his physical incapacitation. The trust explicitly stated that any attempt by a designated medical proxy to withdraw life-sustaining treatment without the unanimous, independent consensus of a specialized neurological board would immediately and permanently void the proxy's standing. Furthermore, any attempt to isolate him from specialized therapy would trigger an automatic legal injunction from the trust's managing partners. He had anticipated her exact sequence of actions. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating the dark room. Julian had seen the reality of his relationship long before the crash. He had recognized Vanessa's predatory nature and had systematically stripped her of any genuine power, leaving her with nothing but an illusion of control. He had built a cage of paper and ink, and Vanessa had walked right into it, completely blind to the bars closing around her. The sheer intellectual dominance of his strategy was staggering. I closed the file and opened the contact directory. I spent another hour reviewing the secondary files. There were detailed forensic accounting reports documenting Vanessa's unauthorized expenditures during their engagement, unauthorized lines of credit opened in his name, and a staggering amount of transferred funds that she had attempted to hide in offshore holding accounts. Julian had been building a comprehensive case for a massive civil lawsuit prior to the accident. He was not just planning to break off the engagement, he was planning to dismantle her completely. The depth of his preparation matched the depth of my own silent endurance. We were both strategists. The paper fortress held strong. The clock on my laptop read 2 a.m. I picked up my phone and dialed the Los Angeles number printed on the heavy cardstock business card. A sophisticated automated system answered. Requesting a client authorization PIN, I typed the 4 digits. 4719. The system paused, processed the sequence, and immediately bypassed the standard holding queue. The line rang twice before a woman answered. Her voice was sharp, awake, and completely devoid of warmth. It was Eleanor Vance. I introduced myself. I did not apologize for the late hour. I stated my name, my clinical position, and my relationship to Vanessa. Eleanor remained silent, allowing me to speak. I told her that I had accessed the encrypted archive located at the Monterey facility. I confirmed that I possessed the details of the irrevocable trust and the forensic financial reports. I waited for her to challenge my authority or threaten me with legal action. Instead, she asked a single, precise question. She asked how I had acquired the decryption sequence. I explained the reality of Julian's medical condition. I detailed the locked-in syndrome diagnosis. I described the blink code we had established, the agonizing process of spelling out words, and the sheer force of will required for him to transmit those 4 numbers. I explained that his medical chart currently reflected a vegetative state only because Vanessa had systematically isolated him from competent neurological review. Eleanor listened to the clinical data with the cold, calculating silence of a predator tracking a scent. When I finished detailing his cognitive awareness, the atmosphere on the line fundamentally shifted. The final piece of Julian's puzzle had fallen into place. Eleanor informed me that the firm had been preparing to initiate a hostile intervention based on Vanessa's recent attempts to liquidate minor assets, but they lacked the undeniable proof of malicious intent regarding his physical care. I provided the final weapon. I told her about the recorded conversation from Chapter 9, the exact audio file where Vanessa casually discussed withdrawing his life support to expedite her inheritance. Eleanor's response was a masterclass in controlled aggression. She did not express shock or moral outrage. She simply confirmed that the audio recording constituted definitive proof of attempted fiduciary and medical fraud. She outlined the immediate sequence of events. The firm would mobilize their crisis management team. They would secure an emergency judicial order, overriding Vanessa's medical proxy by dawn. She instructed me to meet her associates at the facility entrance at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. We synchronized our watches. Before she disconnected the call, Eleanor asked me one final question. She asked why I was risking my own professional standing and my family ties to execute Julian's plan. I looked at the dark window of my apartment. I thought about Leo, sleeping safely in his specialized bed, completely unaware of the leverage he represented. I told Eleanor that my family ties were precisely the reason I was doing this. I told her that some chains are only broken when you shatter the person holding the lock. Eleanor offered a low, dry chuckle of agreement. She recognized a fellow strategist. The line went dead. The trap was completely set. The coastal morning was deceptively bright and clear. I arrived at the designated coffee shop 2 blocks away from the Monterey Recovery Facility at exactly 9:45. Eleanor Vance was already seated at a corner table. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, wearing an immaculate grey tailored suit that projected absolute authority. A thick leather briefcase rested on the table in front of her. 2 younger, equally sharp-looking attorneys flanked her sides. I approached the table and handed her the encrypted flash drive without a single word of greeting. Eleanor plugged the drive into a secure tablet, her eyes scanning the data with rapid efficiency. She verified the contents, nodded once to her associates, and closed the device. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a heavy lanyard attached to a visitor credential. It was not a standard guest pass. It clearly identified me as a specialized clinical consultant retained directly by Vance and Associates. It was a piece of plastic that legally insulated me from Vanessa's termination order. She handed it to me, her expression unreadable. She briefed me on the timeline. Vanessa had scheduled a press conference in the main atrium of the facility for 10:30. She had invited prominent medical journalists and key stakeholders of the Sterling Empire. She intended to publicly announce her heartbreaking decision to transition Julian to palliative care, thereby securing public sympathy before the corporate board could question her authority. Our objective was not to stop the press conference. Our objective was to let her build her stage, step up to the podium, and then completely dismantle the foundation beneath her. We walked the 2 blocks to the facility in a tight, silent formation. The security guards at the main entrance, who had been instructed by Vanessa to bar my entry, stepped forward to intercept me. Eleanor did not slow her pace. One of her associates simply held up a court-stamped injunction bearing the signature of a federal judge. The guards looked at the seal, looked at Eleanor's cold expression, and immediately stepped back, opening the glass doors. We walked past the reception desk and headed straight for the VIP wing. The air felt charged, heavy with the impending collision. We are moments away from the truth. Tell me, what do you think Vanessa deserves? Let me know below. I separated from the legal team and moved quietly down the corridor toward Julian's room. The door was unguarded. I slipped inside. The room was empty save for him. The nurses were entirely occupied with the media circus gathering in the lobby. I walked to his bedside. His eyes found mine instantly, burning with a fierce, restless energy. I reached into my bag and prepared the final dose of the specialised muscle stimulant doctor Aris had prescribed. I administered the injection precisely. I leaned close to his ear and told him it was time. I watched the subtle changes in his physiology as the medication took effect. The stimulant would not cure his condition, but it temporarily enhanced the neural pathways controlling his facial muscles and his neck. It gave him the fractional mobility required to operate the specialised communication interface I had smuggled in earlier. I attached the neuro-assisted sensor array to his temple and positioned the digital voice synthesizer near his throat. We ran a brief, silent diagnostic test. His eyes tracked the digital keyboard on the screen. The machine emitted a low, synthetic hum. He was armed. We moved toward the lights. The main atrium of the Monterey facility was a masterpiece of architectural design, featuring soaring glass ceilings and polished stone floors. Today, it served as a theatrical stage. 24 journalists and photographers were clustered behind a velvet rope. Camera lenses reflected the morning sunlight. At the front of the room, a podium had been erected, flanked by tasteful arrangements of white lilies. Vanessa stood behind the microphone. She wore a perfectly tailored black dress that conveyed mourning without sacrificing an ounce of glamour. Mrs. Sterling sat in a chair slightly behind her, her face pale and drawn, a portrait of a mother broken by impending loss. I stood in the shadows of the western corridor, gripping the handles of Julian's specialised, motorised wheelchair. The neuro-assisted interface was fully engaged. The digital screen hummed quietly. I watched Vanessa adjust the microphone. She bowed her head, allowing the cameras to capture her profile, before looking up with a manufactured expression of profound sorrow. She began her speech. Her voice was steady, practiced, and dripping with artificial emotion. She spoke about the tragedy of the accident, the grueling months of hope, and the devastating reality of medical science. She used words like compassion, dignity, and letting go. She thanked the medical staff for their tireless efforts, effectively neutralising any potential future whistleblowers by praising them in public. She described the grueling emotional toll of sitting by his bedside day after day, waiting for a miracle that would never arrive. It was a flawless, sickening performance. She was manipulating the empathy of the room to execute a hostile financial takeover and a localised murder. Mrs. Sterling lowered her head, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. I looked down at Julian. His eyes were locked on the distant figure of Vanessa, hard and entirely unforgiving. He blinked twice. The signal. I disengaged the parking brake on the wheelchair. I did not rush. I pushed the heavy chair forward with slow, deliberate steps, emerging from the shadows of the corridor into the bright, sunlit expanse of the atrium. The soft, mechanical whir of the chair's motor was barely audible at first, masked by the sound of Vanessa's tragic monologue. But as we moved closer to the centre of the room, the dynamic shifted. A photographer near the edge of the velvet rope lowered his camera, his brow furrowing in confusion. He nudged the reporter standing next to him. The reporter turned. The movement created a ripple effect through the press pool. One by one, the lenses pivoted away from the podium and focused on the western corridor. The clicking of camera shutters escalated into a rapid, frantic staccato. Vanessa, realising she was losing her audience, paused mid-sentence. She looked up, annoyed by the distraction, and followed the gaze of the cameras. Her eyes locked onto the motorised wheelchair. The silence in the atrium was not the respectful quiet of a press conference. It was the sharp, breathless vacuum of total shock. Mrs. Sterling raised her head from her handkerchief, her red-rimmed eyes widening in disbelief as she saw her son sitting upright, out of his bed, and moving toward the light. Vanessa stood frozen at the podium. The microphone picked up the sharp, ragged intake of her breath, broadcasting her sudden terror to the entire room. She gripped the edges of the wooden stand so tightly her knuckles turned a stark, absolute white. She had built her entire stage on the premise of his absence. Now, the ghost had arrived to audit the play. The room fell absolutely silent. I pushed the wheelchair to a halt exactly 10 feet away from the podium. I locked the brakes and stepped back, folding my hands in front of my scrubs. I became part of the background. This was not my confrontation. Julian's eyes were fixed on Vanessa with the precision of a laser sight. The journalists were completely still, their audio recorders thrust forward, capturing the thick tension. Vanessa opened her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward the security detail, but before she could utter a command to have us removed, a mechanical, synthetic voice echoed through the vast space. Vanessa. The voice was flat, robotic, and generated entirely by the neuro-assisted interface tracking the minute twitches of Julian's ocular muscles. It sounded devoid of humanity, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Vanessa recoiled, actually taking a physical step back from the microphone. She stared at the small speaker mounted on the chair. The press pool erupted into a frenzy of whispered questions and frantic typing. A man who was supposed to be a brain-dead husk had just addressed his fiancée by name. Julian's eyes moved rapidly across the digital keyboard interface. The machine processed the input and delivered the next sentence. You spoke of sitting by my side. You spoke of dedication. The robotic voice paused, the cadence strictly controlled by his eye movements. Tell this room what specific financial report was read to me every morning at exactly 8 o'clock. The question hung in the air, a razor-sharp blade suspended over her carefully constructed narrative. It was not a dramatic accusation of murder. It was a simple request for data. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed. She looked at the reporters, then at Mrs. Sterling, whose expression had shifted from grief to sudden, sharp confusion. Vanessa attempted to pivot, using the strategy she had relied on her entire life. She tried to soften her voice, to sound accommodating and gentle. Julian, darling, she stammered, her voice trembling. The trauma has confused your memory. I read to you every day. I read poetry. I read the prayers your mother requested. I sat holding your hand for hours. The machine did not hesitate. Incorrect. The synthetic voice cut through her lie with brutal efficiency. Poetry was never read. My hand was never held by you. Julian's eyes locked onto hers again. Question 2. What specific essential oil was applied to my pulse points every evening at 6 to prevent neurological degradation? The journalists were practically holding their breath. This was a cross-examination conducted by a man trapped in his own body. Vanessa stared at the machine, the colour entirely drained from her face. She had absolutely no answers. Chuang hai moi train hai moi bay. Much tiao nam trum na moi ja viet bon trum na moi bon tu. Self-correction, extending to hit, nam trum kung. She looked wildly around the atrium, searching for an exit, searching for a friendly face. But the cameras were merciless, documenting every second of her public unravelling. Mrs. Sterling slowly stood up from her chair, her gaze moving from the panicked face of the woman she had almost trusted to the relentless, unblinking eyes of her son. The matriarch was not a fool. She recognised a systematic dismantling when she saw one. Vanessa tried to speak again, a desperate, breathless sound that formed no coherent words. She looked at me, a silent, furious demand for me to intervene, to save her. I maintained my calm, dignified silence, my hands neatly folded. The silence was the heaviest verdict in the room. She had absolutely no answers. The camera shutters continued their frantic clicking. the only sound filling the massive glass atrium. Vanessa remained entirely frozen at the podium, her knuckles white, her mouth slightly open. Julian's robotic voice had demanded a simple verification of facts, and she had utterly failed the test. The reporters, sensing the blood in the water, turned their recorders toward me. I did not step into the spotlight. I remained standing beside Julian's wheelchair, my posture straight, my hands still neatly folded. I did not need to shout to be heard. I opened the leather-bound notebook I had carried with me for months. I did not look at Vanessa. I looked directly at Mrs. Sterling. I spoke in a clear, measured clinical tone, exactly as I would during a formal medical briefing. On Tuesday, the 14th of October, at exactly 8:15 in the morning, the quarterly earnings report for Sterling Tech's European division was read aloud. The ambient room temperature was adjusted to 72 degrees. The sensory trigger applied was organic cedarwood oil on the left radial pulse point. I turned the page. On Thursday, the 16th, the topic was the hostile acquisition of a rival semiconductor firm. The sensory trigger was a weighted compression blanket applied for 20 minutes to regulate a spiking heart rate. The heart rate stabilized from 112 beats per minute to a resting 78. I closed the notebook and looked at the press pool. There were no prayers. There was no poetry. There was only data, sensory regulation, and absolute silence. I watched the realization hit Mrs. Sterling like a physical blow. The matriarch of the family, a woman who prided herself on absolute control and razor-sharp judgment, suddenly understood that she had been entirely deceived. She looked at Vanessa, her expression hardening from shock into a terrifying, icy rage. Vanessa tried to salvage the unsalvageable. She stammered something about being too overwhelmed with grief to remember the trivial details, claiming that my clinical notes meant nothing compared to a fiancé's love. It was a pathetic, crumbling defense. I did not argue with her. Arguing gives a manipulator a platform to twist the narrative. I simply let her words hang in the air, hollow and completely unconvincing. The contrast between my meticulously documented data and her frantic, emotional deflections was absolute. The journalists were writing furiously, their eyes darting between the composed sensory therapist and the unravelling socialite. Julian sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on the woman who had planned to end his life. He blinked once, a command to proceed. I reached into the small compartment on the side of Julian's wheelchair and withdrew a small, sleek, digital tablet. It was directly linked to the facility's internal security server, specifically the hidden acoustic monitors I had activated weeks ago. I connected the tablet to the wheelchair's high-fidelity speaker system. I did not offer any dramatic preamble. I merely tapped the screen, selected the audio file marked with the date of Mrs. Sterling's last visit, and pressed play. The truth required no volume. The recording began with the sharp, distinct click of the heavy oak door closing. Then, Vanessa's voice filled the atrium. It was not the weeping, trembling tone she had used just moments ago at the podium. It was cold, arrogant, and dripping with profound boredom. "I am so incredibly bored," the recorded voice complained, echoing off the high glass ceilings. "This facility is depressing. I am missing the entire social season in Los Angeles." A collective gasp rippled through the press pool. Mrs. Sterling closed her eyes, her hand gripping the armrest of her chair. The recording continued, mercilessly clear. "The doctors have practically given up hope. It is only a matter of time before they officially declare your condition permanent." The reporters stopped typing. They were entirely captivated by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty broadcasting from the speaker. Vanessa, standing at the podium, looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her. She reached out, grasping the microphone stand for physical support. Then came the final devastating segment. Once the final neurological assessment confirms zero higher brain function, my medical power of attorney becomes fully executable. I will make the compassionate decision to discontinue this entirely pointless life support. I will inherit the trust, maintain the sterling connection, and finally be free of this sterile, depressing room. The audio file ended with the sharp, aggressive clatter of a medical tray hitting the floor the exact moment I had intervened to stop Julian's heart from giving out. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. It was a dense, suffocating quiet that swallowed all the air in the atrium. The mask had not just slipped, it had been pulverized into dust. There was no defense against her own words. She had confessed to attempted medical murder and financial fraud with breathtaking arrogance. The photographers did not even click their shutters. They simply stared at the woman who had just publicly destroyed her entire existence. Julian's eyes remained fixed on her. The robotic voice from his interface spoke one final time. "Your performance is concluded." Vanessa looked around the room, her eyes wide and wild, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The wealthy stakeholders looked at her with pure disgust. The journalist looked at her like a predator, looks at wounded prey. "Mrs." Sterling stood up, her posture rigid, her face a mask of absolute unforgiving fury. She did not yell. She simply pointed a trembling finger toward the exit. The devastation was complete, but a desperate animal will always attempt one final strike. Vanessa, recognizing that her social and moral standing were obliterated, decided to rely on her final legal safety net. She looked toward the back of the room, her voice cracking as she shouted for her representation. A man in a sharp, slightly overly tailored suit stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. It was the aggressive estate lawyer she had hired. He carried a leather briefcase and a look of manufactured indignation. The final desperate struggle had begun. The silence was absolute ruin. The lawyer marched toward the podium, clearly attempting to seize control of the narrative through sheer volume and legal jargon. He raised a hand, demanding the attention of the press. He declared that the audio recording was illegally obtained, inadmissible, and highly manipulated. He pointed at Julian, raising his voice to echo through the atrium. He stated that a few eye twitches did not constitute legal competency. He pulled a thick document from his briefcase and held it up. It was the medical power of attorney.
"My client," the lawyer announced, his voice booming, "is the sole designated medical proxy. She retains absolute legal authority over Julian Sterling's care. Given the severe distress and illegal manipulation occurring in this room, we are exercising our right to immediately transfer the patient to a secure, private facility." He looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing. "Security, remove this unauthorized therapist from the premises immediately. She is trespassing and interfering with critical medical procedures."
2 facility security guards, confused by the conflicting authorities, took a hesitant step forward. Vanessa's face registered a fleeting, desperate flicker of hope. She thought the paper shield would hold. I did not move. I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded and my breathing even. I knew exactly what was about to happen. I gave a subtle nod toward the main entrance of the atrium. Eleanor Vance stepped out from the crowd. She did not rush. She walked with the slow, measured pace of an apex predator. Her 2 associates flanked her. She approached the podium, completely ignoring Vanessa, and stopped directly in front of the aggressive estate lawyer. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened her heavy leather briefcase and withdrew a bound legal document bearing the seal of a federal judge. She handed it to the man. "That is a certified copy of an irrevocable trust established by Julian Sterling, fully funded and executed prior to his incapacitation," Eleanor stated, her tone dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. It explicitly voids any existing power of attorney in the event of suspected medical or financial mismanagement. It is accompanied by a federal injunction stripping your client of all proxy rights, effective immediately. The opposing lawyer scanned the document. The colour drained from his face as he realised the sheer, unassailable power of the paperwork. He closed his briefcase, took 2 steps away from Vanessa, and silently retreated into the crowd. The paper fortress stood unbroken. The facility's security director, finally understanding the true hierarchy of power, approached the podium. He did not ask Vanessa to leave. He simply instructed his guards to escort the trespasser off the premises. Vanessa's departure was entirely devoid of grace. There was no final, defiant speech. As the guards placed their hands firmly on her elbows, the press pool surged forward, the camera flashes blinded her, and the shouted questions regarding her attempted fraud battered her from all sides. She stumbled toward the exit, a broken, humiliated figure, her designer heels slipping on the polished stone floor. I watched her disappear through the glass doors. I felt no surge of triumph, no dramatic adrenaline rush. There was only the quiet, settling weight of a closed ledger. The debt had been paid. The account was balanced. The journalists, realising the main spectacle had concluded, began to murmur among themselves, reviewing their explosive footage. Eleanor Vance and her team smoothly took control of the press pool, directing them toward a designated briefing room to distribute the official, legally vetted statements. The atrium slowly emptied until only 3 people remained near the white lilies: Julian, his mother, and myself. Mrs. Sterling stood perfectly still for a long moment, staring at the empty podium. Then she turned slowly and walked toward us. She did not look at her son first. She looked directly at me, the formidable matriarch, a woman who commanded boardrooms and dictated urban skylines, appeared incredibly small and profoundly tired. She stopped 2 feet away from me. She did not offer excuses. She did not try to justify her blindness. She clasped her hands tightly in front of her and spoke with a voice that was brittle but sincere. She told me that she had failed her son. She admitted that she had allowed convenience and social conditioning to blind her to a monster hiding in plain sight. She looked at my generic medical scrubs, then at my face. She offered a formal, deep apology. She thanked me for doing the job a mother should have done. I looked at the woman who had previously ignored my existence. I could have demanded more. I could have pointed out her complicity in Vanessa's tyranny. But revenge is a tool for the powerless. And I was no longer powerless. I accepted her apology with a simple nod. I told her that the focus now needed to be entirely on his rehabilitation. I maintained my professional boundary, signalling that while I accepted the peace, I did not require her validation. I turned back to Julian. Mrs. Sterling nodded slowly, understanding the boundary I had drawn. She stepped past me and knelt beside Julian's wheelchair, her hands gently resting on the armrests. She wept, quietly and genuinely, burying her face against his shoulder. Julian did not look away. He blinked once, a slow, forgiving acknowledgement of his mother's presence. I stepped back, giving them the space they desperately needed to begin repairing the damage. The war was officially over, and the quiet, monumental task of rebuilding could finally commence. The air was finally clean. 6 months is a surprisingly short amount of time to completely dismantle a toxic life and construct an entirely new one. The heavy coastal fog of Monterey had burned off, replaced by the brilliant, unbroken sunlight of late summer. I stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new administrative office. The view did not overlook a sterile, depressing hospital parking lot. It overlooked a meticulously designed sensory garden filled with soft, tactile textures, calming water features, and muted, natural acoustics. This was the Sterling Sensory Therapy Centre. I had not accepted a massive financial settlement simply to disappear into quiet, meaningless luxury. Wealth, when utilised correctly, is merely an instrument to engineer a safe environment. I had used Julian's profound backing and my own rigorous clinical expertise to build the largest, most advanced neurological rehabilitation facility on the West Coast. The centre was designed specifically for patients the medical establishment had given up on. We specialised in the silent, the locked-in, and the profoundly misunderstood. I looked down at the garden below. Leo was sitting on a specially designed adaptive swing, gently rocking back and forth under the shade of a large oak tree. He was smiling. There was no anxiety in his movements, no residual fear of the chaotic, aggressive energy that used to define our existence under Vanessa's rule. His tuition was no longer a weapon held over my head by a malicious sister. His future was permanently secured, fully funded by an educational trust I had legally cemented in his name. The vulnerable child she had used as a pawn was now completely untouchable. Vanessa herself had faded into the pathetic background noise of the city's legal system, without the immense financial backing of the Sterling Empire. Her curated social standing evaporated overnight. The wealthy elite, who had once kissed her cheek at charity galas, suddenly could not remember her name. She was facing a mountain of aggressive civil litigation for her attempted medical fraud, effectively bankrupt and completely isolated. I did not feel pity for her. I did not feel lingering anger. She was simply an obsolete variable that had been permanently removed from my equation. I turned away from the bright window and walked back to my solid oak desk. My leather-bound notebook, the exact same one that had chronicled the silent, terrifying war in the hospital room, sat open next to a stack of new patient files. We were operating at full capacity. People flew in from across the country seeking the specialised, deeply empathetic care we provided. Mrs. Sterling occasionally visited the centre, not as a demanding tyrant, but as a quiet, respectful observer. She had learned the hard way that true power is not about controlling people. It is about protecting the vulnerable. I had taken the trauma of being silenced and weaponized it into a system that gave the voiceless a chance to be heard. The air was finally clean. The heavy, soundproof door to my office clicked open. I did not look up immediately from the clinical chart I was reviewing. I recognised the distinct, uneven rhythm of the footsteps entering the room. It was the slow, deliberate sound of aluminum crutches making contact with the hardwood floor. I finished writing my clinical note, capped my pen, and finally raised my eyes. Julian Sterling stood inside the doorway. He looked fundamentally different from the man who had been trapped in the sterile hospital bed 6 months ago. The pale, sunken features had been replaced by healthy colour and sharp, focused energy. He was wearing a simple dark sweater and slacks, looking more like an academic than a corporate titan. He was operating at about 80% of his former physical capacity, a miraculous statistical anomaly that absolutely baffled his former neurological team. He navigated the crutches with the same relentless, methodical determination he applied to his business acquisitions. He walked across the room and stopped at the edge of my desk. He did not offer a grand cinematic declaration of love. We had bypassed the need for theatrical romance entirely. He simply reached out and placed a matte black paper cup on the polished wood. It was an iced Americano. No sugar, exactly the way I preferred it, to maintain focus during long administrative shifts. He remembered the minor details, the small, specific preferences that Vanessa had deliberately ignored for years. I picked up the cup. The condensation was cold against my fingers. I took a sip and looked at him. We did not need to fill the space with unnecessary conversation. Our connection had been forged in the absolute, terrifying silence of a medical prison. We had communicated entire strategies, fears, and promises using nothing but the microscopic twitches of his eyelids. That level of shared trauma and mutual survival creates a bond that cannot be replicated by ordinary social interaction. We understood the fundamental architecture of each other's minds. He manoeuvred around the desk and leaned against the edge of the wood, careful to keep his weight balanced. He told me, his voice a low, steady rumble, that the board of directors had unanimously approved the integration of his new medical technology patents. He had used the time spent locked in his own body to mentally design software interfaces that could bypass physical paralysis. He was turning his nightmare into an industry-altering reality. He had not just survived Vanessa's assassination attempt, he had monetized the experience to ensure no one else would ever be trapped. He reached out and rested his hand lightly on my shoulder. His grip was firm, steady, and incredibly grounding. There was no hesitation in his touch. We were both builders now, constructing entirely new empires out of the ashes our abusers had tried to leave us in. The silence between us was no longer a cage. It was a shared sanctuary. He smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that completely transformed his face. The foundation was completely indestructible. There is a pervasive, deeply flawed narrative in our society regarding the concept of family. We are conditioned from birth to believe that biological ties or legal adoptions form an unbreakable contract. We are taught that endurance is synonymous with loyalty and that tolerating toxic, manipulative behaviour from the people we share a roof with is somehow a moral obligation. I spent the first 20-something years of my life subscribing to that exact lie. I allowed Vanessa to reduce my existence to a series of servile tasks and silent humiliations, all under the guise of familial duty. I was wrong to accept it. Walking away from a toxic environment is often framed by outsiders as an act of profound loss. People look at you with misplaced pity, assuming you are broken because you are untethered from your roots, but they fundamentally misunderstand the physics of a poisoned well. Severing ties with people who only view you as a resource to be exploited is not a tragedy. It is an excavation. It is the necessary, sometimes painful process of clearing out the debris to make room for the people who actually recognise your inherent value. I think about the irrevocable trust, the single, meticulously drafted document that dismantled Vanessa's entire reality. It sits in a secure vault in Los Angeles, a permanent monument to the absolute power of a quiet intellect. You do not need to destroy someone's life to exact revenge. You merely need to legally fortify your own until their attempts to harm you shatter against your walls. They expected me to be the weeping, submissive victim until the very end. They never anticipated that the quiet girl in the corner was taking notes, learning the mechanisms of their power, and preparing to permanently revoke their access. Julian and I created our own family. It is not bound by blood, manipulation, or historical obligation. It is bound by mutual respect, shared survival, and a profound, unwavering understanding of what it means to protect the vulnerable. We chose each other in the darkest, most terrifying room imaginable, and we carried that deliberate choice out into the light. Legacy isn't what you inherently inherit from the people who raised you. Legacy is the boundary you draw, the sanctuary you build, and the people you actively choose to protect. Blood makes you related, but loyalty and absolute dignity make you family. If you believe that the best revenge is massive, silent success, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. The sun dipped lower over Monterey Bay, casting long, golden shadows across my desk. I placed my pen beside the notebook, perfectly aligned. The days of acting as a shadow were permanently over. I looked at Julian, who was still watching the garden, and I finally allowed myself a small, quiet smile. I closed the ledger,